Hey, good to have you back, seriously. Pour yourself something, get comfortable, because this one's going to take a minute, and I don't want you half listening while you're doing the dishes. Actually, you know what? Do the dishes. This story deserves better focus than most, but I trust you to keep up. Let's just get into it, because there's no clever way to ease into this one. The story is already moving, and if we wait for a tidy opening line, we're going to miss it. So, here's where we start. There's a particular kind of silence that shows up right after someone gives in to a bully, and it is not the silence of peace. It's the silence of everyone in the room doing math, calculating what they lost, what they kept, and how loudly they're allowed to admit it. That is the silence that has been sitting over one of America's most storied law firms for the better part of a year, and it just got a lot louder because new reporting has cracked that silence wide open, and what's underneath it is not what the firm told you it would be. Let's set the table properly, because if you only caught the headlines when this happened, you got the shortest, least interesting version of the story. Early in this Trump administration, the White House went after law firms, not with subpoenas, not with hearings, with executive orders, punitive ones. Orders that stripped security clearances, canceled federal contracts, and made it functionally impossible for firms to represent certain clients if the administration didn't like who they were representing. It was, by any conventional legal reading, a pressure campaign dressed up in official letterhead, and more than 20 of the country's largest law firms were targeted. Now here's the part that should stop you for a second. Every single firm that chose to fight this in court won. Everyone. Federal judges across multiple cases looked at these executive orders and said, more or less, this violates the Constitution in several different directions at once. Due process. The right to counsel. Free speech, take your pick. So, if fighting worked and fighting was clearly winning, why did some of the most powerful, best-resourced law firms in the country choose not to fight at all? That's the actual question here. Not, did Trump pressure law firms? We know that happened. The question is why an institution with more legal firepower than almost anyone on earth looked at a fight it was well positioned to win, and decided instead to pay for peace. And the first one through that door, the one that set the price for everyone who came after, was Paul Weiss. I want to be fair to the history here, because the history is actually the most damning part of this story, not an afterthought to it. Paul Weiss was not some anonymous corporate shop that suddenly discovered a spine problem. This is a firm with a genuinely serious civil rights record stretching back nearly a century. It represented defendants in one of the most notorious wrongful prosecution cases in American legal history, back when doing so was not just unpopular, but dangerous. It has spent decades doing legal work in defense of civil rights organizations. This was, for most of its existence, a firm that liked to tell law students it stood for something beyond billable hours. And that reputation is precisely why what happened next lands so hard. When the pressure came, Paul Weiss didn't fight. It settled. The opening price of that settlement was somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars in free legal services pledged to causes the administration approved of. Within weeks, other firms watching from the sidelines saw the number climb. Some settlements eventually landed closer to $100 million in pledge-free work, added up across every firm that folded rather than litigated. And you're looking at something in the neighborhood of $1 billion in legal services essentially conscripted by the federal government, without ever having to win a single case in court to get it. Of course, if you're the administration, why would you litigate when you can just ask nicely and watch the checks? Or, rather, the billable hours start rolling in. Here's the detail that barely made the first round of headlines, and it's the one that actually explains the rest of this story. To free up the enormous volume of pro bono hours, these firms were now obligated to hand over to administration-approved causes. Something had to give. And what gave, quietly, across multiple firms, were the very pro bono departments that used to do the opposite kind of work. The departments that, for decades, had been the recruiting pitch on every law school campus in the country. Come work here, we do good, we take cases nobody else will touch. We represent people who can't afford representation. Those departments had, in the months before the settlements, been actively involved in challenging the administration's own executive orders. So, the settlements didn't just cost money, they functionally dismantled the internal machinery that had been standing in the administration's way in the first place. You don't have to call that a coincidence. I'm certainly not going to. Now, at the time, Paul Weiss's leadership made a very specific promise, and I want you to hold on to this promise because it's about to become the whole story. The firm's chairman wrote to his partners insisting the settlement would not affect the firm's work. He used the phrase, "no effect on our independence," essentially, and told the partners the firm would keep standing up for the causes it always had. Reasonable thing to say publicly. Necessary even, if you want to keep your own people from walking out the door. The problem is that new investigative reporting, a genuinely thorough piece of journalism from the New York Times, went and checked whether that promise held up. It did not. What the investigation found, through internal emails and conversations with multiple people inside the firm, was a leadership team quietly terrified of upsetting the White House, in ways that went well beyond the original settlement. There was internal debate, real, documented, multi-person debate, about whether to scrub the firm's own website. Specifically, the section describing its work combating hate groups, including its history opposing the organizers of a deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, including its work related to the Proud Boys, some of whose leadership were later convicted on seditious conspiracy charges tied to the January 6th Capitol riot. Let that sit for a second. This wasn't a firm being asked to stop doing that work going forward. This was a firm considering deleting the fact that it had ever done it at all, its own documented history, because the history itself might be read the wrong way by an audience of one sitting in the White House. There was even discussion, according to the reporting, of running future website language past the administration for approval before publishing it. A pre-clearance system for a private law firm's own description of its own past legal work. I don't think I need to spell out how unusual that is, but just in case, it's extremely unusual. Law firms do not typically submit their own historical record for government sign-off. That's not normally a category of thing that happens in a functioning democracy. And it doesn't stop at the website. The same reporting found that the firm had been quietly pulling back on pro bono work related to reproductive rights access, at a moment when that kind of work sat uncomfortably close to the administration's priorities. It found that in the process of recruiting a high-profile new partner, someone with a large existing client roster, the kind of hire firms fight over because of the revenue they bring in, that partner reportedly made clear he had little appetite for the firm's social justice-adjacent work, viewing it as a risk to the bottom line rather than part of the firm's identity. And in a detail that genuinely stopped me when I first read it, the reporting describes the firm sidelining a transgender partner amid this broader shift, and quietly settling with that partner for $3.5 million, quietly being the operative word. You don't pay someone $3.5 million off the public record unless you have a very strong interest in nobody asking follow-up questions. Now, I want to bring in one more thread, because on its own, it might read as an unrelated scandal, but in context, it's really not. The managing partner who negotiated the original settlement and who wrote that reassuring letter about independence has his own complicated history. In pursuit of a major private equity client back in 2011, he built a relationship that, through the client's chairman, eventually connected him to Jeffrey Epstein. And according to the reporting, he later offered Epstein free legal advice. This after Epstein's earlier conviction was already a matter of public record, not some hidden detail that only came out later. That connection stayed mostly out of view for years, until a trove of Justice Department documents surfaced it earlier this year. Once it did, the pressure was immediate, and he stepped down as chairman of the firm. His replacement, notably, is reported to be considerably less enthusiastic about the progressive causes the firm had spent decades publicly associating itself with. So here's where I think the actual significance of this story lives, and it's bigger than one firm's bad year. What you're watching, when you line all of this up, is not really a story about a law firm's public relations problem. It's a case study in what capitulation actually costs once you get past the press release. The public version was, "We made a pragmatic business decision, nothing changes, we remain who we've always been." The private version, now documented in black and white, is, "We quietly reconsidered our own history, sidelined an employee whose identity became inconvenient, pulled back on causes that might irritate our new counterparty, And did all of this while the person who negotiated the deal was simultaneously dealing with the fallout of his own association with one of the most notorious criminal cases in recent American memory. Those are not the same story, and the gap between them is, frankly, the entire point. It's worth remembering because I think it's easy to lose the thread here that this same basic pattern, settle quietly, insist nothing has changed, quietly change anyway, is not unique to one law firm. You saw versions of it play out in media as well, most visibly around the corporate ownership changes at a major American broadcaster, where editorial independence was publicly promised and then, according to multiple journalists inside that newsroom, was not entirely honored in practice. I'm not going to pretend every case is identical, because it isn't. And there are still plenty of people inside these institutions doing serious, honest work without interference. But the pattern itself, powerful, well-resourced American institutions, choosing the path of least resistance against pressure that courts have repeatedly ruled unconstitutional, that pattern is now well established enough to have a name in academic circles. Scholars who study how democracies slide toward authoritarian governance have a term for this. They call it anticipatory obedience, giving up ground before anyone even forces you to, simply because you've decided resistance isn't worth the discomfort. And what should genuinely worry you, as an American watching this from the outside, is that the institutions doing this anticipatory obedience are not small, powerless, or financially desperate. They are, in almost every case, sitting on enormous reserves of money and legal talent. They had the resources to fight. Some of their peers did fight, using those exact resources, and won in federal court repeatedly. The firms that folded did not fold because they lacked options. They folded because folding was, in the narrowest and most immediate sense, easier. And that's really the uncomfortable center of this whole story, if you strip away the specific names and dates. A country's rule of law depends in no small part on institutions being willing to be inconvenienced in defense of it. Courts can rule correctly all day long, but if the people and institutions those rulings are supposed to protect voluntarily surrender the protection before it's even tested, the ruling becomes mostly theoretical. What we're watching with Paul Weiss and with the firms that followed its lead is what it actually looks like when a pillar of the American legal system quietly decides that theoretical protection isn't worth the practical cost of using it. The consequences of that decision don't stay contained inside one firm's org chart. They ripple outward, into which clients can actually get representation against the government, into which civil rights cases get pursued, and which quietly don't, into what young lawyers are taught is normal and survivable, and eventually into how much the phrase equal justice under law is allowed to mean in practice, versus how much it's simply allowed to remain carved into a building. So, no, this story isn't over, and I'd be lying if I told you exactly how it resolves, because frankly nobody fully knows yet. The reporting on this is still developing even as I record this, and there's a reasonable chance more of it surfaces before this video is even a week old. What I can tell you is that the firms who chose to fight are still fighting, are still winning, and are still, as far as anyone can tell, the same institutions they claimed to be before all of this started. And the firms who chose the quiet settlement are discovering one investigative story at a time that quiet doesn't mean private forever. It just means later. Which is, if you think about it, a fairly expensive way to learn a lesson that was available for free, right there in the history the firm itself used to be proud enough to put on its own website. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, Analysis from the Edge. If stories like this one are worth more than a headline to you, stick around because we're just getting started. And the quiet ones are usually where the real story is.